Welcome, friends! Today I want to show you this really neat card game that I like. It's called Kaiju Kaizen. It used to be called Domain TCG, but now they've rebranded it as Kaiju Kaizen. So this is pretty cool. First off, it plays in your web browser, so you don't have to download anything. I haven't played a browser game in a really long time. I don't know if they're still popular, but I remember all those sketchy sites that used to be like a hub for them. And then there's those ones that try to serve ads and viruses to grandmas with gambling addictions. Anyone ever been on Pogo before? So it plays in your web browser. You give it an email and log in to pick a starter deck, and the starter decks are pretty good. You can actually win quite a bit by just using the starter decks. So the way this works is that you pick a card in your deck to be the king, and then you play on a board and move the cards around like chess pieces. The cards have mana costs, and then you can only play one card a turn. I can't make up my mind if these two systems work well together, or if it would be better to be able to play as many cards as you can, so long as you have the mana to pay for them. Because there are also a lot of cards that have zero mana cost. And it's not just the resource cards either. There's a lot of units and spells that you can play for zero. But because you can only play one card per turn, the go-wide strategies feel like they're just not fast enough. Swarm strategies kind of suck, because you can't play all of your low-costed cards on the same turn. But also being able to play one card per turn keeps things moving, without having one player taking a really long turn. And you already have to consider how you're going to move all the cards you already have in play, so maybe it's better that way. Or maybe it would be better if only the resource cards had zero mana cost. Either way, you start with 0 mana, but the player that goes second actually starts with 15 mana, which is quite significant in this game. So just about all of the resource cards give you somewhere around 5 mana per turn change, so it's about 10 mana per whole turn cycle. And then there's some others that can give you around 30 all at once, if you sacrifice something or if you meet certain conditions. So starting with 15 as the player who goes second is really interesting. Like, you might even prefer to go second, even as a highly aggressive player in this game. So the mana costs are also quite a bit all over the place. Costs for cards range anywhere from 0 to 70. And then attack values and hit points also have a really wide range as well. Like, Skeleton Warrior has 4 HP and hits for 2 damage. And then this guy, the Star Eater, has 74 HP and has an AoE attack that does 23 damage to all adjacent cards. So scaling up to play powerful cards is really the name of the game. Maybe that's why they renamed it to Kaiju Kaizen. Because a kaiju is one of those giant monsters you see in the movies like Godzilla. The game wants you to go big. Alright, so you can only play one card a turn, and it has to go on a space adjacent to your king. The king mechanic is pretty cool, and you can actually choose any unit in the game to be your king. So it's not like you're limited to only using a certain subsets of units as your king, like how in Magic a commander has to be a legendary creature. You could make the Skeleton Warrior your king if you really wanted to, even though you're really meant to pick one of those big boys. The king always starts in the center row, on opposite sides of the board like this, and that one card you get to play per turn has to go in an empty adjacent space to your king. And the new units can also move in the same turn that they come into play. And the king can also move. There's a handful of different move types notated on the right side of the card. First we got the single, where you can move in any direction, only one space at a time. Then the straight line, which works kinda like the queen in chess. And then the cross, which is like the rook in chess. And then you might see either of those with a number like cross 3 or straight line 2, which means you can move in those directions but only that many spaces. Then there's zigzag. Zigzag goes a lot of places. And then we've got jump, which goes like every other space. And then the side jump, which is like the way the knight moves in chess with its L-shaped movement. You can hover over the opponent's cards to see where they could go next turn, so you don't have to waste a whole lot of time working out the different movement types. I do wish that there was a description or a visual that you could get by hovering over the move type. It's not really an issue for cards on the board because you can hover over them to visualize their movement, but for the cards in your hand, or if you're deck building, it would be a quality of life feature. So you move your boys around to attack. Attempting to move your unit into the space of another initiates an attack. And if it kills the enemy, then your guy goes in that space. But if it doesn't, then it goes right next to it and deals its damage. Units can either move or use an ability. Both of those actions exhausts a unit. So a single unit can only do one or the other on a single turn. And not all of the monsters can do attacks by moving either. Some of them can only do damage with an ability. But there are also some others that are purely utility and have no attacks at all. I really like having to strategically place your resource cards, and being able to attack them. You really have to consider where you want to put those, and how, or if whether or not you even want to defend them, or if your strategy is to go after the opponent's resources, or if you should just go after their king instead. There's a lot of interesting options and permeations that each game has, and nothing really seems to be optimal either. All of the strategies seem to have a fair amount of counterplay, and it also seems like everything has at least one blowout matchup, and that also just seems to be a part of any game, especially in card games. Not that it's a good thing to have matchups where one side just doesn't really get to play, but that is a part of it. And it's also a part of the fun to hedge your bets against different matchups when building your deck, because you can only bring so many cards. And in this game, deck minimum is 20 cards up to a max of 30. And you start with 4 cards in your hand, and then draw 1 per turn, and then you can play up to 3 copies of each, and the king counts separate from the 3. So you could play 4 of a card that way if there's one that you really like. Having low deck sizes really helps the consistency as well. I think deck building is right where it needs to be, because you really need to open in a certain way depending on your strategy, and you pretty much always do. I haven't seen but only a few bad opening hands, so the ratios are pretty good. You also don't lose the game after drawing out your deck, and there's no maximum hand size either. And it kind of has to be like that because we're basically playing chess, and matches can easily go on for a lot more turns than you would have cards in your deck. And this is why it's also not bad to play above the minimum. Having to weigh consistency against late game card advantage is really interesting. And as you can see, the spaces on the board are all different types of terrain. None of them really have any special effects, except for just this one that gives a defense bonus. It would be cool if they all had a little different something about them, but it might also be tedious and cumbersome to keep track of if they all had a different effect. There's already enough to keep track of as it is. But the units themselves also have different effects for being on certain types of terrain. Many of them get an attack bonus on certain types. Some others get movement bonuses for being on a certain type of terrain. And then there are some that have special abilities, like generating mana, that only works on a specific type. There's also some cards that have something like this aquatic ability, where they can only move or attack on water, and they also take damage if they're not on a water space. And there are also a lot of abilities that change the terrain as well, so if you're trying to play an aquatic strategy and then the opponent changes the terrain on you every turn, you can't really even get going. I really like to use this guy as my king in an aggro strategy, and he gets a move bonus and an attack bonus on 2 different types of terrain. And water just happens to be one of them. And then I've also got some swamp synergy, so I have a handful of abilities to change the terrain to swamp. And water decks don't even get to play against this guy. He just crushes them. Playing online against other people is really cool, but there's also a fun single-player challenge mode. The tower mode is trying to win a number of consecutive matches in a row against the AI. It's a good challenge, especially because the different strategies sort of rock, paper, scissors each other, so it's kind of hard to actually win 5 in a row. But beating any of the tower modes for the first time gets you 10 packs. And the packs are really cheap if you wanted to spend some real money. I spent $40 buying the $20 bundle 2 times, and just about got every card in the game. And you also get coins for playing matches against other players too. I'd say that the monetization is priced fairly well, but it is also buying random cards. And I'm also not going to go wild to get that last copy of some certain card that I want. I've got a deck right here where I want to build around this particular card, but I'm 1 short. I'll get it eventually from the free packs, or I won't. And then when I finally do, I'll probably be playing a different deck anyway. So playing the game is a lot of fun, but trying to decipher the text on some of these cards is like reading broken English. Alright, so right here we got Cloning Seed. True copy. Copy a card of cost 20 or less. If on this is on swamp. I mean, we know what it's trying to say, but sometimes figuring out what a card does is just a matter of having to play it to find out. The text on some cards could be cleaned up quite a bit. Most of them read just fine, but the text does feel like it needs some polish. Also, the Scorched Terrain Power bonus is kind of hard to see on the black background of the cards. While none of the strategies stand out as the dominant one, I feel like there's a handful of cards that are extremely efficient. Now, I tend to play mid-range style decks in card games, where you either act as the aggressor or the control player, depending on what your opponent is playing, so it could just be my bias and the frame of reference that I see the game in, but I want to show you some cards that I think are really strong. This guy, the Deep Space Warrior, is probably my favorite card in the game. It can move up to 5 spaces in all directions like a queen, and then it's got relatively high HP and attack power for its cost. And then it also heals 2 HP per turn change, which is actually 4 HP per whole turn cycle. It's really easy to get one of these on board before your opponent really has a chance to set up, and it can chase down just about anything and clean up your opponent's resource cards. Here's another card that I really like, the Chimera. It costs a little bit more than that Deep Space Warrior. It's got the same movement type, but it goes 1 less space, and the trade-off is just a little bit more damage and 2 terrain bonuses. It's good, but the spaceman is a lot better. At 20 mana, I really like the Giant Scorpion. It's got about double the HP of other cards that usually cost 20 mana, and it's also got good movement and gets an attack bonus on 2 types. Another thing that I really like about this game is that all of the mana generating cards feel pretty well balanced. None of them really stand out as being overtuned, but I have a preference for this one because it works on any terrain. It gives 5 mana per turn change and then it hurts itself. I like to pair it with a card that can heal it every turn, or sacrifice it with a big mana card on the last turn before it would go out, or turn it into an undead by attacking it with a vampire so I can resurrect it for the rest of the game. And resurrect is a pretty cool mechanic. It only works on undead cards, and you have to pay the mana cost of any card that you would resurrect, but it also doesn't count as the one card that you get to play each turn. And a lot of the cards that you want to resurrect over and over again cost 0 anyway. It's a fun strategy to play, but I also don't feel like there's enough good cards in that synergy to go all the way with it. It works much better when you mix it with something. And on that note, you're not really locked into any particular archetype or faction. You can just play any card in any deck and it's fine, which makes it easy enough to fit in cards for counterplay, and the synergies also aren't so hyper-focused that you have to go all or nothing. But there's also enough cards of each type that you could also just fully commit to one archetype if you really wanted to. There's a lot to explore here. I think the board is pretty cool. It reminds me a lot of that Yu-Gi-Oh game, Duelist of the Roses. That game would have really benefited from having some different movement types. And I really like the king mechanic. Kaiju Kaizen has a lot going for it, and I hope they continue to develop it. It's engaging, and you actually interact with your opponent. In so many of the card games nowadays, you just completely ignore the other player to do some combo that locks down the board or auto-wins the match. It feels like a fresh glass to finally play a game where the board state slowly progresses as you and your opponent push and pull at each other. I really like this game. It's interesting.